All right, welcome and thanks for joining us today for our symposium. We are presenting on something we're calling Connecting the Dots, and it's myself, Wendy Rinke, I'm from the University of Missouri, Kathleen Lane from the University of Kansas, Steve Kilgus from the University of Wisconsin, and then Keith Herman is going to be our discussant from the University of Missouri. So my presentation is on the National Center for Rural School Mental Health. So the National Center for Rural School Mental Health was funded back in 2019 by the Institute of Education Sciences. And one of the reasons for this National Center is that we know that about 20% of school-age children experience serious mental health issues, but very few receive services. And this is a situation that has been exacerbated in our rural settings. So the purpose of the National Center is to enhance the capacity of rural schools to identify, prevent, and intervene in youth mental health concerns. And this is a partnership across the University of Missouri, University of Virginia, and the University of Montana. The co-PIs on this with me are Catherine Bradshaw from Virginia, Keith Herman with me here at University of Missouri, and Ryan Tolson-Nee, who's from the University of Montana. One of the foundations of the National Rural Center is the development and refinement of a system that we're calling the Early Identification System. This is a universal social, emotional, and behavioral screening tool that schools use with students in grades K through 12. And it targets different sub-areas that we know from research are directly linked to mental health problems or the development of mental health problems over time. So for instance, attention and academic issues are related to later problems with depression, externalizing problems. And so each of these subdomains are indicators or risk indicators that if we catch them early, we can actually do something to potentially prevent later social, emotional, behavioral health issues. Here's an example item from the Early Identification Student Survey. So students in grades 3rd grade through 12th grade each complete this survey at least 2 times a year. So we administer it in the fall and then the winter. We have some schools that administer it 3 times a year. But each of the items are, they're pretty easy, user-friendly items. Like this one, I have friends to talk to at school. And then there's the smiley face to the frowny face, and they go through each question. Now, the fun part about this is we actually got feedback from students about the smiley faces because we thought some of the kids might think that it wasn't cool, like in high school, but they really had no issues with it. And they actually thought it was helpful for them to kind of guide, the directionality of the question. So that's just an example of what the student survey looks like. And then we have sort of an innovative approach to getting teacher feedback on students. We call it the teacher checklist. And this was developed by a colleague of ours, Aaron Thompson, who's in social work here at the University of Missouri. He used to be a principal in an alternative school placement and developed this for use with his students there. But basically, teachers have a list of students in their classroom. And then we have a list of risk indicators at the top, and they just go through and they check a box if that student has that risk indicator. And what we found is this is like a really simple way for teachers to quickly assess their classroom. And in elementary schools, this can take as little as 10 minutes for teachers to complete. So it's really feasible and teachers really like it. Now, one of the things that we are trying to do is make sure now that schools have all this data that they can use it in a user-friendly way. And so we've built different types of reports that as soon as the checklist closes, this is all computerized. As soon as it closes, this report will populate. And so what you see here is a school-level report for the teacher checklist. And each of the indicators are broken down within their subdomains. And then it shows what % of students in that building have indicated that the teachers indicate that as a risk area for them. And then it changes from green, yellow to red, depending on the number of students in the building who experience that. And so when we talk to our schools, we say, if you see something in the red, that's something that you want to focus on. If it's in the yellow, it's something to think about. If it's a green, it's actually something going really well for your school. So here you see in this report, there's an item that says has no close friends, 22.9% of students in the building. said that, or the teacher said that that was a problem for them. And the reason we turn it red is we're kind of using the public health model, right? So if you have 20% or more of students in your building who have this as a risk indicator, it doesn't really make sense to go fix it one kid at a time. And that's something that you might want to think of doing a universal prevention intervention for, something else like that. Here's another report that we've developed where we call it the teacher-student comparison report. And so basically this takes the student and the teacher report and puts it alongside each other. So you can see there's teachers on the left and the student report on the right. And this just gives you a really quick way to look at how the risk across both of those types of assessments per student. So you can use this in a problem-solving meeting really quickly. I can't do that here, but you can actually sort these. So if you wanted to see who was your top, had the most internalizing behaviors for students, you could click on student here and it would populate all of the students who turn red. And when they turn red, this is another piece that's really important about this assessment system, is locally normed in the school building. So if a student turns red on one of these assessments, it means that there are 2 standard deviations above risk on that particular construct in comparison to the peers in their building. And one of the reasons that we developed it in this way is that if you have, sometimes when you use these nationally normed universal screeners, you might end up, if you're at a higher risk building, with more than 50% of the students in your building being identified as needing an intervention. And that's pretty hard resource-wise for schools, but with using the local norms, those that turn red are the most at risk in your building. And so you know where to direct your resources to. And so that's one of the nice things about this assessment. And then lastly, so we have the school level reports, then we have the comparison report, and then you can drill down to individual student reports. And so this is an example student level report where on the right, you have the student survey items and how they were indicated by the student. And then on the left, you have the teacher checklist, which shows how the teacher rated that student. And so you can actually, there's a notes section in here. So if you're a problem solving team, you can pull up this student and you can make notes about what types of interventions you hope to implement or that are being implemented with that student. And you can save that and view that over time. So lastly, so now that this is the whole connecting the dots, right? So we have the data and then we have the reports that are user-friendly, that are red, yellow, green, that really are help driving schools to identify what areas they want to focus their resources on and where they want to intervene. And lastly, one of the things we found was that sometimes, even when you have those reports and maybe they say, oh, externalizing problems is where we want to dive in, but then the intervention they choose either isn't evidence-based or maybe isn't even connected to that type of problem. And so one of the things that we've been developing through the National Center is what we're calling the Intervention Hub. And so it's the Early Identification System Intervention Hub. And you go onto this website and you see exactly the subdomains that the EIS Universal Screening System has. And so if you're interested in externalizing problems, you click on externalizing problems. And let me see if I put that next. You click on that and it pulls up this next options. And so if you're in elementary school, you click on elementary school and then you pick which tier intervention you want to work on. So if you're looking at that school report and you have the 20% problems in externalizing problems, you're in elementary school, you would click on Tier 1 Universal, and it pulls up a menu of options of different evidence-based interventions that a school could use. So for instance, if you clicked on externalizing problems and it was a classroom, you have a classroom level problem, it links you to an intervention we call the classroom checkup. And just examples of different levels. So each developmental level has a menu of options, and then each level of intervention, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, has a menu of options. And the reason for that menu, rather than just directing them to one single intervention, is that we know that schools have different resources, different contexts, and so we want to allow them to have the option to choose from that menu what they think will work best. And so one of the things that has been interesting, so we've been using this system in our local area for the past 7 years, and we recently just looked at this data longitudinally over time to see if fidelity to the model, which is using the data, using the reports to guide intervention, and then implementing those interventions and progress monitoring and evaluating whether they work or not, if fidelity to that overall model it demonstrates improvements for students. And so this is just a recent article that came out where we looked at the population of 3rd through 12th graders over a 3-year period. And this is a growth mixture model where we looked at the different varying types of students, would you say, that are out there. And so you can see from this, there's a low stable class, right? So that's the majority of students, and it's around 80%. So it's kind of falling into that public health model. And then there's a group that's the high stable group, and that's about 10% of the population. Then we have a group that starts out high and over time is decreasing. And then we have a group that starts out low and increases over time. One of the things that we found by looking at this is those students who are increasing over time were much more likely to be in a low implementation school. So they had odds of 1.28 times more likely to be in a school that's not implementing the model with high fidelity. So with that, the National Center is a 5-year, it's a funded center for 5 years. We're in our 3rd year. We're currently doing a feasibility test. So we're in about 30 rural schools right now where the schools are implementing the universal screening system and then using our intervention hub to identify interventions and implementing them over time. So we're going to be following them across the year and then get some feedback from them in the end. And then next year, we're pushing out to do a full level evaluation of the model, where we're going to do a randomized control trial for years 4 and 5 across 110 rural schools across Montana, Virginia, and Missouri. And with that, that's my presentation. And I'm going to pass this off to Kathleen Lane next.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Lane, and I'm from University of Kansas, and I want to thank Wendy and Steve and Keith for the opportunity to be here today. And I was really enjoying listening to Wendy's presentation. It inspires me, and I'm excited to learn more about the process and the products that she's creating. I want to just spend a little bit of time sharing what we're doing on our research team on Project Enhance. And this work is funded by the Institute of Education Science, as these all are, and ours is one of 4 network grants. And so what I'd like to do is just start by giving you a little bit of an overview about what this project is. And in launching this, I want to say it has been just an incredible gift to getting to work with so many different scholars. And our whole mission of this work is intended to develop enhanced professional learning materials to help schools build integrated tiered systems of support. And specifically, our work is on CI3T. It is comprehensive integrated 3-tiered models of prevention. And these models put in place explicitly academics behavior, which is the theoretically grounded in applied behavior analysis, PBIS, positive behavior intervention support, is at the center. And it also has a firm commitment to students' social and emotional well-being. And through the years of this work, which has started in 1996, we have fully manualized the building process by which teams and districts come together to build this one integrated system that features all the offerings for students at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. What is less developed are the professional learning resources to support through the journey of implementation. And while their traditional materials have been in use for a number of years, they are not yet online, web-based type resources. And so with the scope of Project Enhance, our goal was to build from lessons learned from other IES grants that we've had, most recently a partnership grant with Lawrence Public School Systems, who's one of the partners in this grant, and the others are 2 districts from Kansas and another district in the first year from the state of Washington, another from Vermont. But in this collective team that we put together, this has been a wonderful opportunity to have partnerships with people with expertise in school psychology, applied behavior analysis, and school-based intervention. So I want to honor my co-PIs and project directors that you see here on the screen. And it also features a number of coaches. We are currently in the 3rd year of this project, working in 35 schools in 4 different districts. So in terms of what we've learned, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the journey is for Enhance. Starting with this idea that in the first year, we were getting information across 3 geographic regions to help drive the intervention design process that we're engaging in right now. And it has been a gift to have this actually take place before and during the COVID era, because we've had an opportunity to really listen intently and engage in a structured flexibility type of process by which we're gleaning information about real-time immediate demands for what people need right now to be able to not only move forward with tiered systems of support, but do so in a way that is efficient and effective for the students as well as the teachers themselves. So the whole premise of this is we want to guide people through their academic journey through the school year, beginning before the students get there, which is the 0 month. And then we help schools to use the data that they are already collecting as part of regular school practices. So they're bringing in information that they themselves are collecting on treatment integrity at tier 1 to see what parts are being taught, what's being taking place in terms of reinforcement, how they are using screening data, not just behavior, but also academic data with other data such as office discipline referrals, attendance, et cetera. So they're using programmatic data regarding implementation and social validity to get input from the adults in the building to find out what they think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes. So those programmatic data are coupled with student level data, and then that's all being used to drive professional learning. And one of the main distinctions between CI3T and more traditional types of tiered systems of support is that all professional learning is grounded in using data to inform the decisions about what is needed in terms of professional learning. During the COVID era, that first year, we were fortunate actually to have Project Enhance already in place and underway. And whereas I know it was a struggle for a lot of teams to be able to move forward, we actually gained additional partners during that time as people began to seek out, asking for immediate assistance to figure out, like, how do I use my CI3T structure to pivot to remote, hybrid, and in-person instruction? And we had over 22,000 page views on our CI3T website that were specifically dedicated to figuring out how to make that pivot. So it's taking a step back in terms of the very first year of this project. This is where I'd like to start, because one of the first things that we did in this project is we had a series of planned studies to find out what the professional learning areas of need were and how they wanted to access this information in the long term. So what we did is we designed a series of 3 separate studies. And I want to mention that one of the other things that's been a highlight of this project is we've had the opportunity to work with more senior colleagues as well as some junior colleagues. So we have Sandy Shafulis from University of Connecticut, Amy Breach from Northeastern, Wendy Oakes from Arizona State University, Eric Common, who's an assistant professor at University of Michigan, Flint, and David Royer, who's now at University of Louisville, Kentucky. And it's all been run by these extraordinarily talented people, and a recent project director, Mark Buckman, Rebecca Sherrod, and Jamie Jones. So keep in mind, there's a lot of people behind this. So the first thing what we did is we wanted to reach out from the leadership perspective. So when school systems are building these comprehensive integrated systems, we know that that's building and steering a big ship. So we wanted to find out from district leaders and from principals what they felt like their biggest needs were. And so using a series of interviews and focus groups, we learned that there were some key priorities about they needed resources to be able to onboard leaders into a system. So rather than hiring people and saying, hey, we've got the system in place and you need to catch up on your own time, they needed that onboarding and training resources. And they needed the ability to communicate the vision during the hiring process and the onboarding process to help them lead in a way that didn't bring in competing paradigms or competing philosophies or district initiatives that were kind of counterproductive to the overarching mission. And a large part of that also is making sure that they knew how to access and provide ongoing professional learning to support not just the initial installation, but also the ongoing implementation of these innovative systems. The next thing we did was a series of studies related specifically to systematic screening. And at this time, again, we were in 3 different geographic regions, literally from coast to coast. And we had some people that were in their very first year of implementing. We had some that were in their second, third, fourth, and even sixth year of implementation. And so there was a huge range of variability in terms of people's expertise with respect to screening in particular. And some of the early work done by Amy Breach, there were lessons learned about in many schools. There was academic screening was far more implemented than was behavior screening. But in each of these schools implementing CI3T, they all had academic benchmarking happening 3 times a year. They all had behavior screenings implementing 3 times a year. And in some of these initial lessons learned, and this took place through a series of interviews with the CI3T leadership teams, and those teams included the principal, 2 general education teachers, a special education teacher, a parent member of the team, as well as other people that supported implementation. It might have been a counselor, a school psychologist, a behavior specialist. And what they said is they felt that some of the biggest benefits was that it was providing information to look for kids at the first sign of concern, especially internalizing issues, because that was loud and clear. People in these buildings felt like without screening, they know that they would be overlooking kids with internalizing issues. And they also felt like it was normalizing that process by which we're looking systematically to see who might needs more than Tier 1 has to offer. Also through this process, because people were in different stages of implementation, they were also identified some barriers that were useful information. For example, there were some inconsistencies across respondents in terms of what they knew about how those data were collected or how they were used, and in particular, how those data were used in tandem with other data collected as part of school systems. By systems, I mean the method by which they monitor things like attendance and office discipline referrals, as well as academic screening. So we identified some strengths and some areas of concern. Then the third study we did in the first year was all about figuring out what people wanted in terms of additional professional learning knowledge and how they wanted to access it. So Eric Common, who I mentioned was one of the assistant professors on this project, he led a very large scale survey, and it was replicating some work done by Eric Carter and Wendy Oakes earlier on CI3T. And this took place in all the districts. And it wasn't just the teams providing information, it was all faculty and staff. We wanted to find out what their biggest areas of identified need were. And what they were saying is number one priority, people wanted information about how to support teachers in gleaning information and others about how to de-escalate students. And so in particular, they wanted to learn about like Jeff Colvin and Terry Scott's work on managing acting out behavior and knowing how to intervene at each stage. A second big priority was social skills. And like many of the lessons that have been learned from Michael Uden and other state leaders like Randy Watson in Kansas, we're learning that kids often are graduating very competent with academic skills, but they're needing more in terms of those social skills that they need to do well into employment. And then finally, the third big priority was, again, supporting kids with internalizing issues. And that was a thread, that was a theme even before the COVID era. Also in that survey, we learned how people wanted to access that information. They valued time in district during work hours so that it wasn't cutting into family time. There was a high interest in actually gleaning college credit or badges, that type of distinction, as well as some asynchronous opportunities and teacher collaboratives. So all that information was learned in the first year from all of the participating sites. And then what we did in the next 2 years of this project, and again, we are in the third year right now, we pulled this information and we began to create professional learning modules to address some of these areas of need. And what we're doing right now is in each of these districts, they are moving through their normal CI3T implementation. So they meet 5 times a year as a CI3T leadership teams. Their districts meet monthly, and they're monitoring everything happening, not just at a school, but across the district. But in the context of these sessions, we are interacting with people, sharing these new resources, and we're engaging in design work. Very similar to the previous Goal 2 competitions that used to be categorized in the goal numbers. Now, upon all that initial information that we learned in the first year about what the priorities areas were in terms of screening and building the team's capacity for what professional learning resources were needed and how they wanted to access it, we distilled it down to plans for what we thought at the time, which makes me laugh now, is that we thought it would come up with these 8 specific modules. And we thought that there was going to be about 3 modules prepared for leading in a CI3T system that would be for district and principal leaders. We thought there would be about another 3 sets of modules that would be for the teams themselves so that the teams could support faculty and staff with implementation. And then we thought there'd be these 2 buckets of information for screening. Well, as we got underway, we learned really quickly and thankfully from experts in the field, from our advisory board panels, from some content area experts, and from the teams themselves, that we needed to have much smaller units of information. First thing we asked is like, which of these areas that we came up do you think are the biggest priority? Because now we are entering the COVID area. We wanted to make sure we were building what was the most immediately useful for them. So this figure that you're looking at was just some simple information gleaned from respondents about where their biggest priorities were. And as they identified those priorities, like when they said, what we really need help with right now is, supporting, creating positive, productive learning environments and being prepared to support kids that have additional challenges, the kids that need more than Tier 1 has to offer. Then we asked where within those Tier 2 type supports, where are your main areas of interest? Like, what do you think your biggest needs are? And we learned that supporting kids who are managing or struggling to manage those feelings of being anxious, that was a number 1 priority that you're seeing on the right. Additional support on direct behavior ratings, which Sandy Schafulis and her team have done excellent work through the years. That those were the 2 main priorities that people were interested in. So after that little sorting activity, and again, this information is literally collected when they're coming together to do their own data-informed decision-making. We use that as the springboard to know which of these, what we are now calling mini modules, were starting to take place. At this time, as part of our design work, we now have 3 available leadership modules that help people to lead within a CI3T system. And those are focused on helping understanding everybody's roles and responsibilities within the system level, how to onboard people. And it's not just onboarding principal leaders, but how do I bring in teachers and paraprofessionals and other professionals into the system to protect the integrity of what the mission is? And then how do we run those effective meetings? In addition, all the yellow that you're seeing are all components of various Tier 2 supports and fundamental principles like the hows and whys of behavior, how behavior is shaped either unintended or intended. One of the modules that I do want to just briefly mention to you is this module that was of particular interest, people's first priority about supporting students who are feeling anxious. And when we talk about a module, we've learned that people prefer a module that has 2 components. So it's like a little tiny ebook as well as an interactive resource. And we've spent some time playing with different mediums as to how that would look. And we're very fortunate to have many talented people on our team, including David Royer, another assistant professor who has excellent design skills. And so right now, what I'm showing you is just a couple of the samples of what the interactive resource looks like. So these are short video clips. They are short things it's kind of like a tricked out PowerPoint. It's built through iSprings. And these are parallel. So somebody could read about it in an ebook. They could watch this interaction. And at first we thought we were going to get some direction from participants to say, which of these would you like to have? And the answer was clearly both. And what people said is they often enjoyed being able to look at and listen to these interactive resources to learn more about like what this strategy is, see all the features like you're looking at here, like how do I measure fidelity? How do I build this plan for an individual student? Looking to see what that scope of materials are like these breathing strategies as one mechanism. And in this whole intervention, we're teaching kids how to recognize what their body feels like when they're feeling anxious, how to use a self-monitoring component to monitor not only how they're feeling, but actually how they're using some of these strategies during instructions. And this one also has lesson plans that were developed under Mark Buckman's leadership for actually explicitly teaching kids the strategies. And the idea would be these would be like a Tier 2 support for kids that are screening in with higher than average internalizing issues in systems where we've got about 80% of the kids responding. In addition to that, we wanted to make sure that everything that somebody would need as a practitioner or as a researcher to conduct future inquiry is included in this module. So there's data collection systems that the student would complete for self-monitoring, that the teacher would complete. There's even graphing resources that you can log in and graph the resources. So this would be an example of what one of those modules might look like. And similarly, these are also developed, as I mentioned, for the leaders in this system to know when to focus on different types of tier 2 and tier 1 practices. So for example, in onboarding new system, we've learned some from other literature that has been unique from that of the special education and school psychology literature. And we've learned a lot about mentoring and what those core components need to be in terms of welcoming somebody, not just to with their knowledge and their skills, but also thinking about building that sense of belonging and understanding the culture of the community that people are coming into. I also want to say that on our team, amongst the many wonderful coaches, we've had the honor of working with previous implementing principals. And this whole project is focused at the elementary level. So we have Howard Dyken and Tammy Becker, who had previously led very successful CI3T implementation in a district that was also fully implementing CI3T. So I think that's been a real strength throughout this last 2 years, has been learning from these people who have now retired and have joined our research team. In terms of that evaluation component and how we've been doing it as part of this iterative design process, even this evaluation process itself has iterated. But in brief, we have begun by first getting input from our advisory board and experts on both the content and the topic of those areas. And then materials are brought and shared in the context of these CI3T leadership team meetings. And in those, we initially started by asking them questions before they looked at the modules and then after it. And then we shifted to asking questions just after they had iterated with it and had enjoyed either reading the ebook or looking at the interactive resource or both. And as part of that, we wanted to find out what they thought specifically about the utility of it. And then we invited them to go use those resources with their faculty and staff. And now we have those set up on a website where faculty and staff can log in using a password and access that information. And at the end of this spring semester, we will be going back and working through some of the modifications for those resources that have been built today. We have an ambitious set of plans to continue building additional modules from those that I just shared. In terms of what the ebook piece might look like that they would read before looking at it and before providing feedback would be like this. They would read through this ebook, they'd look through that interaction. And then what we did in terms of the expert panel is first we just asked people what they thought about like the design elements, like with the design features, the assessment features, and we gave a lot of opportunity for open-ended input. And then we use that to help design a modified version of the usability rating profile. And this work was led by Sandy Shafilis and Amy Breach. And so we adapted that tool for specific use within a CI3T model. So some of the things that we're learning from this is that many people that have weighed in on the initial content and then the design information that's there now, they're suggesting that they're finding it both feasible and useful and effective and something that they think would be supported by their colleagues as they bring it in. We've asked them for that proximally, meaning as soon as they're learning about it, and then we wait a little bit of time. And in general, it's been a couple months following sessions complete and in the different materials, we're checking back to see of these things, what have you used? And getting more of a distal measure to see, were you able to use any content that followed? And if so, how did you use that content? And from there, we're saying, was there an opportunity to use it? How fully did they feel like they were able to, incorporate it into their own professional learning with their faculty and staff? And in particular, we've also got questions regarding the role of the families and how this information's been shared. And because of the value of the homeschool partnership, we have gone through and tried to make these pretty detailed table of contents with images to show which resources, like which infographics, which scribe videos, which little tiny short clips of videos that are like 2 minutes long that might be most appropriate for families or with faculty and staff, etc. So overall, that is what our design plan has looked like. And also along the way, we are attempting to also measure what the team members are reporting in terms of how knowledgeable they feel, how confident they feel, and how useful they feel these materials are. And as we're drawing to the end of our design year, what we'll be doing, as I mentioned, is taking all the information from the last 2 years of implementation with people using these different resources in different capacities. And then we will be building out in the last 2 years of this project a quasi-experimental design to see how people who have used and have not used this full suite of materials are faring, not just in terms of implementation, but how is it moving the needle in terms of students' performance academically, behaviorally, and socially. And then we are in a new partnership with some partners that have not participated in this design work. And we are in the beginning stages of planning a randomized control trial to see how that new set of resources compares to traditional CI3T implementation resources. So we are hopeful at the end of this project that we will have an on-demand free access set of resources available to all as they are moving forward and implementing integrated tiered systems of support, and with clear indicators of how to use the data to drive the decision-making process is of what content to cover and how people might want to receive it.
Hi, I'm Steve Kogas. I'm an associate professor in the school psychology program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that was great, Kathleen. That was fantastic content that you just shared. That's really exciting and expansive and really incredible work. So thank you for that. Same goes for Wendy as well. So I just want to talk about a project that is coincidentally also funded by IES. That we're in our final year of right now, that has been supporting the development and validation of the intervention selection profile, or what we've been calling the ISP suite of tools. So the ISP tools are meant to be used as part of problem analysis. So we've heard from both presenters today some talk about universal screening, or the types of assessment we would do to identify students who need additional support. The goal of problem analysis then is kind of the follow-up to a screen. So you identify a kid needs additional support. What are the types of assessment that we can conduct that tell us a little bit more about the student, about their individual needs, and therefore give us information about the type of interventions that might be most appropriate for those students, given the nature of their needs, right? So the goal here is basically to match students to interventions that are most appropriate for them. We think about the types of problem analysis assessment that we were interested in developing and validating. We kind of went back to, kind of first principles and thinking about what types of concerns, or what are the reasons why a student might be engaging in problem behavior within the classroom, within the school building. We can think about this, and it's been kind of, this cuts across multiple fields, but there's kind of the whole skill versus performance deficit, that dichotomy, which thinking that a student might be engaging in problem behavior because of a skill deficit, and that they have yet to learn a more appropriate behavior by which to attain their kind of desired end. So for example, a student might be calling out in a classroom to gain a teacher's attention because they have yet to be taught, say at the early elementary level, how to raise their hands and kind of stay and wait for a teacher to call upon them. I have a 4-year-old. This continues to be a struggle for her. But other students might have learned these behaviors. They know they've learned what they're supposed to do, but they continue to engage in the problem behavior despite having that knowledge of more appropriate behavior and appropriate skills. For those students, it isn't necessarily a skill deficit. It's not that we have to teach something. It's that there tends to be a performance deficit, and that the student is not displaying that appropriate skill of behavior with sufficient consistency, perhaps because they're not being sufficiently reinforced for engaging in that behavior. Relatedly, that more problematic behavior might be reinforced more frequently. Therefore, the student's like, well, I'll just engage in that behavior because it's still getting me what I want. So we think it's about the types of assessment that we're doing. We want to make sure we're engaging assessment that lets us know, is this problem behavior present because of a skill deficit or a performance deficit? If we want to know whether or not a behavior problem is a result of a skill deficit, we need to conduct a skill assessment. A type of assessment that would let us know which skills in, say, the social emotional domain has a student acquired and which ones have they yet to acquire, and therefore might be the type of skills we should be instructing, say, maybe in a small group or individual format. We can also conduct a functional behavior assessment, which would give us an understanding of which behaviors are being reinforced commonly, say problematic behaviors, and what is the function of those behaviors. Is a student engaging in that behavior to get adult attention, peer attention, to escape or avoid an academic or social situation? So we can engage in FBA to get an understanding of what's really going on, because once we understand that, we can try to remove reinforcement for the problem behaviors and apply it to the more appropriate behaviors that the students learned. The nice thing about the problem analysis is it's commonly understood as being very important at the tier 3 level. Within special education as well, right? We've known for a long time, if we're going to design comprehensive behavior intervention plans, it's important to engage in a type of assessment that will let us know which interventions are most appropriate for students. Historically, there's been less of an emphasis on problem analysis at tier 2. The way of thinking has been, well, at tier 2, we're just supposed to try something. Maybe it's something like check and check out, which is commonly done in schools, or social skills training. Every student gets the same thing, and then we figure out what their needs are and apply something more specific at tier 3. I think the tide has really changed on this, where we see scholars calling for this and schools engaging in problem analysis at tier 2, with the notion being that if we just collect a little bit of data, maybe we can engage in more appropriate intervention sooner, as opposed to just putting in a student in some type of intervention, crossing our fingers and hoping that it's appropriate for them. So there's been some resource considerations with schools being worried that, like, well, we just did a bunch of universal screening. Now you want us to do another round of assessment before we ever get to intervention? What we find is that through a little bit of additional assessment, we might be able to spend less time in intervention because we're doing something faster that works for students. So we've seen more emphasis on conducting this type of assessment at tier 2. The problem here is that most problem analysis assessments that were created were not designed for use at tier 2. They tend to be pretty intensive. They take a lot of time, or they require the presence of a specifically trained third-party individual, like a school psychologist, who maybe would conduct an interview or conduct a functional analysis or conduct a classroom observation. And it gets challenging to do that at scale. If you think about tier 2 in your average school, if we anticipate within a public health model that 15% of kids are going to require tier 2 supports. Now we're in a school with, say, 300 kids. That's a lot of kids that we have to support at that level and that we would need to conduct assessments with. So our goal within this project is to, well, we want to do problem analysis at tier 2. Can we develop really brief problem analysis assessments that could be used at scale at tier 2 without taking too much time or effort? So the goal of our project, or Project ISP, has been to support the development of the ISP skills and the Isp function, which I'll spend some time talking about in a little bit. Phase 1 of our project was focused on tool development and refinement. We did more correlational research with larger samples to support the initial development and the validation and the evaluation of the accuracy of both tools and giving us information that's relevant to intervention. We then conducted a series of training, development, and testing studies where we went out and we designed trainings that would support teachers in not only collecting these data within schools and giving us accurate information, but we also evaluated training protocols that were meant to evaluate or support accurate decision-making with these data. So, the question was, could we just throw a report at a school psychologist or a school counselor, social worker, and they'd be able to give us accurate recommendations and conclusions? Or would we need to provide more specific training to make sure that they could give us good information and make accurate decisions about what's going on and which interventions are most appropriate? Phase 3 that we're actually in now, and that was delayed as a result of COVID, but we're in the throes of at this moment, is supporting the evaluation of treatment utility and looking at the extent to which these interventions actually contribute to more effective and to larger intervention outcomes. So right now we're conducting a series of single case design studies where we're collecting the ISP data and then identifying matched and mismatched intervention for students that are part of these studies, and then applying those both in an alternating treatments design to see, really, do students do better in the presence of matched intervention, therefore suggesting the ISP measures are recommending more effective interventions. So we'll start with the ISP skills. Here's a portion of it here on the left. The ISP skills is meant to give us information about student social emotional skills and student academic enabler skills. The social emotional skills are aligned with the CASEL framework in that we get information about student self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, all of those big 5. And we also get information about 4 academic enabler areas, which are motivation, academic engagement, organization, and study skills. The measure is founded upon diagnostic classification modeling, which is very similar kind of in spirit to item response theory. DCM provides scores that are basically probability scores, or probability that a student has mastered certain skills. DCM has been used extensively within the academic realm, so in developing and scoring reports for, say, math measures, where we get information about the probability of students mastering division, different algebraic or geometric type areas of math. But we're trying to apply its use within the kind of social emotional domain, where we can get information about the extent to which students have mastered certain skills within that area. The goal is for this measure to be used at a single time point. So say if a student was flagged a universal screener, we would administer the ISP skills to get an understanding of which skills a student has yet to acquire. The nice thing about DCM is it presumes that each item within your measure gives you information about multiple skills at once, right? So maybe, and this kind of comes from the notion, say on math, that maybe you have a certain algebra problem that gives you information about a student's algebra competency, but it also gives you information about, say, like their division competency, subtraction, addition, some more basic skills. So the same item gives you information about multiple skills at once. So the goal is that we can model that so that we can administer a smaller number of items, but get information about still a larger number of skills. So we specifically use DCM in developing this measure so we could keep it briefer. This gives you an example of the type of score report that we get from the ISP skills, where we would get information about, on a 0 to 1 scale, the probability of a student having mastered that skill. So with this particular student, we see that there really is high probability of mastery for self-management and self-awareness. There's some concern in the social awareness area, but it doesn't go all the way down to where we think that the skill is absent. But with responsible decision-making, relationship skills, a little bit more of complex skills, being likely that the student needs instruction in that area. Within a paper that we published in the Journal of School Psychology last year, we supported the initial development and validation of the ISP skills. And I just bring up this one graph as an example of the way in which we evaluated whether or not the items were doing what we hoped they were doing. So if you look at the red box here on the left corresponding to item 2, we were looking at the probability that a student would be rated as often or almost always exhibiting the behavior that's indicated in that item 2. DCM modeling, basically what it comes to is the model implied likelihood that a student has mastered that skill or not. So I'll use my cursor here, hopefully you can see it. 0 over here would be for students our model suggests have not mastered that skill. And the 1 corresponds to students that have, our model indicates that they have mastered that skill. The y-axis then corresponds to probability of the student receiving an often or almost always on the skill that corresponds to that item. You can see here, if the student did not master that skill, at least what our model suggests, they have a really low probability of being rated highly on that item, whereas if they've mastered it, it's all the way up here to 0.98, which is interesting, cool. But when we get into items that correspond to multiple skills at once, so this particular item, item 3, corresponds to skill 1 and skill 3. And now we have our model suggesting to us there are students that have not mastered either skill associated with item 0, 0, mastered only the first skill within this item and not the second, so 1, 0. They haven't mastered the first, but they have the second, 0, 1, and they've mastered both. And you can see how this kind of flows, that if the student hasn't mastered either, we have really low probability of them being rated highly on that item. If they only have 1 skill, still not that high, but once they've mastered both skills, they have a high probability of the item being endorsed for them, which tells us overall the skill is functioning as intended and that it's giving us information about both skills at once, which is really great for us because we wanted to see that in us designing really a brief and efficient measure, which gives us still information about a large range of skills. We did, as a follow-up to that, a series of receiver operating characteristic curve or ROC curve analyses to evaluate the accuracy associated with all of these scales that we're getting back. Tell us how accurate are they in predicting the presence of skill deficits within each of these areas. We evaluated this by comparing the DCM scores that we got relative to criterion measures, which included the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment, or the DESA, which is a measure of student social emotional functioning, validate relative to the SSIS, the Social Skills Improvement System, which measures, as its name suggests, social skills, and then the ACEs, the Academic Competence Evaluation Scales. And what we find here is that overall, the accuracy of our scales is pretty decent. The area under the curve, which 1 being a perfectly accurate measure, was ranging between 0.84 and I think we have here 0.92, which suggests that we were getting accurate information and telling us whether or not a kid had a particular skill deficit that should be targeted for intervention. So that is the ISP skills in brief. Here is the ISP function, a 5-item measure that's meant to give us information about the extent to which a student's engaging in disruptive behavior, and also the extent to which that disruptive behavior is resulting in a series of consequences, specifically adult attention, peer attention, escape avoidance, and access to tangibles and activities. If we found that a behavior resulted in some of these consequences very frequently, we would think that that particular consequence was the function of that student's behavior or the reason why they were engaging in that behavior. This ISP function is founded upon direct behavior rating methodology. Kathleen spoke a little bit about DBR and the work that's been done by Sage Foulias, Chris Riley-Tillman and colleagues. I was engaged in some of that work for a long time, and part of what I wanted to do within that area is kind of take that behavior ratings and expand it into the functional behavior assessment domain to see if we could also have teachers give us information about the consequences that commonly follow the disruptive behaviors that we see in the classroom. The scores that we get from this measure are interpreted consistent with conditional probability statistics. So for example, we would look across multiple observations on average, how often is the student getting adult attention? How does that compare to peer attention? And we'd find is the more common consequences, as I mentioned, the ones that happen much more often than other consequences would likely be the function of a student's behavior. We suggest that rather than like the ISP skills, which can be completed at a single time point, the ISP function has to be administered multiple times in the sense that we have to collect or administer this measure, say, across at least 5 time points, because we find that the more data we get, the more accurate our decisions are and the more reliable the scores that we get. In a paper that we published in 2019 as part of the first phase of our project, we were looking at the correlation and the accuracy of ISP function scores relative to systematic direct observation data, specifically behavior consequence recording data. So this was teachers completing the ISP function while watching the student while they taught. So they were teaching, they weren't doing anything else except occasionally glancing at the kid and getting a feeling for what their behavior was, what the consequences of that behavior was. Concurrent with that, we had observers in the room also collecting that behavior consequence data during those same 10-minute chunks. So we're comparing teacher ratings completed during that 10-minute time or right after that 10-minute period and comparing that to that systematic direct observation data. We found as the data that we got from teachers to the ISP function was really well correlated with the systematic direct observation data. We didn't see as good a correlations for escape avoidance and access to items activities, but mostly because there was really low base rate on those behaviors. And we think the correlations were attenuated due to those floor effects. If we look at the difference scores between ISP function data and the behavior consequence data, basically if we subtract the ISP function score from the SDO score that we saw at the same time, we find that on average, on that 0 to 10 ISP function scale, the teachers weren't giving us data that was missing or was that discrepant from what we were getting through the SDO data. So that meant that a teacher, while teaching, could still observe the student's behavior, give us accurate estimate how often they were disruptive, and also give us a pretty accurate estimate of how often that disruption resulted in a series of consequences. What I could say from doing that study and a series of studies since, teachers are chronically, they underappreciate how accurate they possibly can be. Often we get these forms handed to us and this is my best guess. It's probably no good. And what we find is they're often really good and really accurate in rating these things. So here's our team. Here's the group that's been working on it. It's Katie Eklund, who's here at the University of Wisconsin with me. Nate Bonderams, who's at South Florida. Dan Magid and Wes Bonifay are our methodologists. Dan's more focusing on the single case design area, where Wes Bonifay is at the University of Missouri with Wendy and Keith, and much more emphasizing the psychometric area, including taking up a lot of the work on the ISP skills. So that's us. And thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Keith Ehrman. I'm from the University of Missouri, and I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on these 3 talks. I'm feeling inspired by the great work that's being done, funded by IES, and this work is all very timely. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen recent Surgeon General report that's focused on sort of the state of youth mental health in this country and concerns about a new pandemic that's starting related to kids, behavioral concerns, emotional concerns. And I think all of this work speaks to, the needs of educators to support youth in this time. And I know all this work started before the pandemic, but it becomes even more relevant now. And in terms of, in particular, I think all of these pieces help educators do the hard work of identifying what the needs are, both of individual students, but also what classroom level needs are, what whole school level needs are. And then the second really hard part is doing that in the context of educating kids and then having to make strategic decisions about how to meet the specific needs of kids or buildings or classrooms. I'm also struck by, we have a lot of great tools and resources that already exist, and a lot of those things have great technical qualities, but they don't ever get used. And so I think the work that we're seeing illustrated here really is demonstrating the importance of working closely with our education partners and not not wondering why they're not using our great tools, but figuring out what the barriers are to their use, and then giving them options about how to get good tools in their hands, and ones that will be practical and ones that will lead to better outcomes for kids. So I'm excited about that. I should also mention, I know Wendy didn't mention in her talk, she kind of focused on the work that she's done as part of the center. But even before that, she was funded by an IES partnership grant that Kathleen supported us in getting by sharing her proposal. So we come full circle. But a lot of that early work, similar to what Kathleen was describing in terms of building partnerships and building out tools that people need. And I know this is part of your work, Steve, too, is like developing them in partnership with educators to see what's working and what doesn't work and why. So I appreciate all that. And I guess I'm also struck by, like, in the lessons of our presenters, like, what are you experiencing, or what have been the biggest surprises in this work as you started it? Because I know I go into work thinking, God, I got some great ideas, and then, wow, I was wrong about that or this. Or so what are you learning in terms of what's been surprising? And then the second piece would be, what are some of the challenges that you still foresee coming? Because I know we all present our work, it's all great and things are going really well, but what still is an obstacle out there that you're anticipating? So two-part question.
I think I would say, Keith, and I appreciate your shout out about sharing. I'm grateful for our profession, that we are collegial and all focused on doing what we can do to best support educators and kids. I feel like all of us in these projects, I feel like we were all in this really uniquely positive place when COVID happened. I am truly thankful that we had these projects, and that we also had the flexibility with IES to make adjustments to research questions, and to really capitalize on the partnerships that were there. Because you're right, like, now more than ever, this isn't the time to be rigid. It's the time to be thinking about how to innovate and adapt and adjust. So, like, I know we have another project called Project Screen, and we were able to, without any additional funding, add questions to see like how screening tools were functioning in the COVID era. So I feel really inspired by the people I'm working with right now, not just on our team, but like in these districts. Like, I'm watching people that, despite these incredibly challenging contexts and, being understaffed at schools and absolutely exhausted in their own life, they suit up, they show up, they come to these professional learnings, they're hungry for what works. And I think that one of the best outcomes of this entire pandemic, if we could call it that, is that the world is on the same page right now with prioritizing kids' social and emotional well-being. Like, the fact that people are hungry to figure out who needs more right now. That's like that's the biggest reach out we've had, is like, help us find a screener. How do we get it placed? And then what do we do? Going back, to Steve's work about, like, how do we quickly and accurately determine what to do next? So I think that priority in social and emotional well-being, and people are really putting the real estate into the daily happenings in schools. They are putting in screenings. They are putting in, validated resources, not just at tier 2 and tier 3, but at tier 1. They're looking at their data. And going back to Wendy's point, like, if it's more than, 20% of the kids, we can't expect them to put all those kids into tier 2. That's a function of tier 1. So, like, that flexibility in the decision making. So I also am the eternal optimist. I remain really inspired and hopeful. And I think my concern is just that people are exhausted, at every single level. So but I think there's a gift of the flexibility on what we're doing. But I just hope that the next generation coming up, I hope that everybody that's in a position to will help good assistant professors and people that are not yet in those positions, help recruit and retain and inspire people to want to stay in this field, because we need the research and we need our district partners.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I would just say too, I think kind of coming back and especially doing this type of applied work, there was the question of, as schools are coming back to be together, I mean, stuff is still not normal. We're still very much in the midst of a pandemic, but I think the question was, how open are they going to be to doing this type of work, particularly like some of like the intervention work we're doing right now, which is a little bit involved and involves a lot of teacher input and a lot of teacher implementation of these things. And I think what I've been surprised by is just how open and positive these schools have been to engaging in this work. I mean, like us doing work in the broader area of safe mental health, schools are really hungry and really dedicated to supporting their kids because they're seeing a lot of need right now. I mean, Kathleen, to your point about like you started with modules, now we have mini modules because schools are at the point of like, hey, we've got a lot and we would like the resources. So I've just been, I felt like this year, like I want to work incredibly hard, not just like to make this stuff good, but to support the schools that we're working with because there's a lot of need and they're wearing it on their sleeve. Like the teachers are exhausted, the students are exhausted, and we're all just trying our best to support them.
Yeah, I was trying to think about what things I'm currently surprised by. I feel like I've been working in the trenches so long that barely anything surprises me anymore. But bye, Steve. I feel like one of the things I've learned over the course of years working with schools is to always be getting continual feedback for quality improvement, because if you aren't getting that feedback and something's going wrong and it gets away from you, then they just shut down some of the things that work for them and they just don't know it. And so I think I think that kind of guides a lot of our work that we do with the National Center, and the work that we did with the partnership grant was really just making sure we're always checking in, like what's working, what's not working, because if they tell us something's not working, we can fix it at the front end. But if we wait a year and they'll find out that something wasn't working, then going into that next year, the universal screening is like too much for them. Right. So I think those are just important things to keep in mind when we're doing this type of work, because we want to be in partnership with them. We want to be building something that they're actually going to use that's feasible for them. And so
I agree. And I think that's the cruxus of all the work that, you and Keith and others are doing. It's the foundation of it is a truly respectful and responsible partnership. And I think those temperature checks, and I truly believe to get anybody's time, that's the biggest gift we can give each other right now, is the time and the honesty of what is working and what's not.
Right. Right.
I would just add to all that too. I think one of the things I've been struck by the last few years is like all the work that you're doing, Kathleen, at the ground, checking in with all partners, getting feedback all along the way. That's hard to sustain, and it's easy to kind of forget one stakeholder not intentionally, of course, but to continually involve the student voice, the parent voice, the teacher voice, to make sure everyone knows why we're doing what we're doing. And that's so important, but it's easy to kind of get off track from that. And we try to do that. And I think that ultimately is what sustains things, is when everyone is sort of on board, they understand.
Yeah. And they're feeling valued and heard, like you said. No, this is great. Thank you both for including me in this conversation.
And we appreciate your time as well. One quick plug that I will have for the whole audience. Wes Bonifay, who Steve mentioned is one of his partners, is a faculty member here. He and I have a special issue coming out in, we're inviting papers for School Psychology, the journal, which is focused on social consequences of assessments. And it's a whole issue devoted to what I was saying earlier. We know a lot about the technical properties of our measures, but so few of us are collecting data about how they're actually used in our absence, how schools are using them to make decisions and making sure that they're having the type of consequences on kids that we expect them to. And so we have several people that have submitted, but the data that you're collecting, Kathleen, I'm certain, now or in the future will speak to some of these issues, because I think it's such an important.
That's great. And if it's okay, I will, off recording, reach out to you, because I have something that I think might be I can at least send it to you. You can see if it's a possibility. So,
awesome. Okay. This was doubly worth my time then.
I'll have it to you by the end of the month. How about that? Great.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to reflect on these important topics.
You guys are wonderful. And I'm so glad, it's just awesome to see what you guys are doing.
I'm going to turn it over to the participants, our audience here. And does anybody have a burning question for the panel?
I see Anne has her hand raised.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm not seeing hands raised, so I'm glad you can see that, Wendy.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. So I have a couple questions for Wendy. I really liked all the presentations, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the early identification screening tool and the cost to schools or districts. And then there was also a screen that you showed where based on the data, there were links to particular evidence-based interventions. And I wondered about how many of those were in like the ESSA tiers, or were they only in like tier 1 or 2? Were they also in the lower tiers for those? Because I think in this, with the schools that I've been working with, it's there's often a lot of interest in not just the tier 1 interventions from What Works Clearinghouse, but other kinds of interventions. Thank you.
Yeah, so currently the early identification system is free to schools that are using it. It was developed as part of a project we have here in our county, where we have 55 schools that currently use it across K through high school. And then it's part of the rural Center for School Mental Health. And so that intervention hub has come out of the work from the rural center, and it does have it directly connects any of the data that you get from the EIS system to interventions across all tiers and across all development. So there's elementary, middle school, and high school evidence-based interventions, and then there's tier 1, 2, and 3. And schools go in and just click on those buttons, and it pulls up a menu of evidence-based interventions that we know directly impact that area of concern. And then they can choose based on the context of their school what they think fits with them. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a great question from Michelle Woodbridge for all or any of the panelists, but just wondering about whether our current menu of options of evidence-based practices need an anti-racist refresh from an equity lens, and also just wondering whether it's our interventions are primarily white-centered based on privileged class, seen as appropriate behavior, and are you getting any pushback about this or encouragement from partners to revisit or visit these issues?
I can say that in our work with CI3T that has been funded for a while, but I'm thinking back specifically to our partnership grant that eventually led to this one. Equity was at the core of the work when the schools were going through the building process for building their CI3T implementation manual. Like on their CI3T leadership teams were families, were students, were educators from the building. And at the base of their CI3T model, they use the same graphic, but at the bottom of it, they put their 3 board goals, which were equity, excellence, and engagement in the community. So it wasn't like searching for the word equity. That was built into the strategies and the practices and the programs. And that has been a consistent feature of all the design process. And some schools even have it that they have explicit equity team members also on their CI3T leadership team. So for our work in CI3T, it's been a fundamental component. That said, I think there's still more work to do within the broader research community to make sure that those questions are being asked and answered with every trial and the design work that's being done.
Can I jump in with sort of a follow-up question or a point, Keith, to what you just said? One thing I wondered about a lot, and Steve, I thought about it a lot in terms of the ISP work, the teacher report aspect of this. I know that with discipline disparities where, Black and brown kids are suspended and expelled at disproportionate rates, there's a real concern that teachers have some kind of, implicit biases about how they're interpreting behavior. And so Wendy, I know with the Rural Center and EIS, you have the student report piece as well. But even there, what your examples you were showing, they didn't, we know those things don't always align. So I guess I'm wondering about sort of in this space, what are the concerns around the teachers' potential biases and how they're rating the kids? So Wendy, I think that's really cool how you do the local norms, right, in the school. But Steve, it's sort of not anchored in that way in the school building, is it? And sort of, what do you think about this whole issue of the teacher's role in it and perhaps perpetuating some of those biases that we're really concerned about?
Yeah, great question. I think obviously this is of concern to us too, and thinking about not only to what extent our teachers bring their biases with regard to how They're interpreting student behavior relative to their cultural based expectations for appropriate behavior for, for norm relative to norms for behavior within the school, but also thinking about how they're interpreting the items, what the items mean to them, and how that's based in their background as well. So part of what we're doing, obviously is testing the biases associated with the items and how they're performing within our sample through series of different analyses, including differential item functioning, but then also being careful in we have plans for continued development moving forward, focusing on cognitive interviewing. So meeting with a group of diverse culturally, socioeconomically, linguistically group of teachers to get their feedback on the items, give us information about how they interpret them, and what it means for them and what kind of information are they pulling from when they're making some of these judgments. But then also having them give us feedback on the scale. So we think this Likert scale that they're using to rate these items functions in this way, what is their interaction with it and what does it mean to them? But then also building towards getting at student self-report versions of this moving forward. The interesting thing is it sounds easy, like, oh, we're asking kids about their social emotional development, let's just ask them. And then you try to put it in a simple way to get some of these complex constructs, and it becomes a little challenging to do so in a way that we're going to get good information for them, particularly if we're thinking about a age range moving from like 3rd grade to 12th grade. How do you make it developmentally appropriate to make sure we're getting information from them while still always having those bias considerations, so that the questions that we're asking are hopefully, we're probably not going to arrive at a universal set of items that we would be asking, but can we make sure that the items we're asking are responsive and appropriate for the students that we're asking them of? So yeah, full consideration throughout, starting with the teacher stuff, but not stopping there.
Emily, I would just add to that, like we've looked at our data over, we have data from our county here for the past 7 years, and we've looked at the types of, looked at whether there's bias in the data, and clearly, yes, teachers are more likely to rate some of our students from diverse backgrounds as having more externalizing problems, having most self-regulation problems, but we're also finding that the students also rate themselves higher. And I imagine it's because of their lived experience, because they're in classrooms with teachers who are treating them as if they have higher levels of externalizing problems. So it's interesting data to look at and to report back to schools so that they become aware of those types of things happening. Yeah.
I would just add one thing to the EIS system is the way that we present data back is really intentional, trying to plant the seed for schools that it's not just about individual student behavior, but it's about risk environments. And so they can look at the data from a whole building level or grade level to see what are the common risk factors that a high percentage of our kids are experiencing, and then what can we do to change those risk factors. And so trying to take it from from a within child perspective to a whole school or grade level perspective.
Thank you. So one thing I'm not sure about is, I think the session's over. Is it ending at 12:45? Yes. Okay, we are out of time, everybody. Well, I hope we're going to continue this conversation. I know I'm going to continue talking to all of you about these individual projects. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And thanks to everybody for joining us today.